Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my updated Pokemon TCG tier list heading into the Vancouver Regional Championships. We still have Vancouver, Stockholm Regionals, and also Brisbane Regionals to finish up the format before rotation happens next month. And I think the format is really interesting right now. We most recently had the European International Championships, which definitely shook some things up. Definitely quite a bit of surprise showings there. So I think this meta is really diverse and one of my favorites in quite some time. So with that being said, if you enjoy the content, make sure you leave a like and subscribe, and let's hop right into it here. So we got plenty of different decks. As I said, one of the more diverse, meta games that we've seen in quite some time. There are so many decks that can compete. So with that being said, let's start off with the deck that most recently won the European International Championships, as that is going to be Cloth Terrapagos. Now, Cloth Terrapagos is a deck that heading into the tournament, a lot of people had, question marks about it. Some people, kind of questioned the viability of the deck, but it showed itself to be one of the best decks in the format, getting first place. There were also plenty more in the top 64 and 32. So the deck just did overall very well. It definitely surprised a lot of people. And I think it's a good deck. I think you take pretty close matchups against the majority of the top decks. Your one really rough matchup is the Archaludon matchup, but if you're able to dodge that, you do pretty well against a lot of the other decks in the format. You take a relatively close Dragapult and Gardevoir matchup. Those matchups are kind of largely built around how much, Badu Poison is able to, kind of carry you at the beginning of the game, or if you are able to get a donk off. I would say that, like your Goldango matchup is, pretty good. Your Lugia matchup is close. Your Miraidon matchup is slightly favored. So your matchups against a lot of the top decks that have been showing up actually are pretty decent. So yeah, I think that Cloth definitely makes a pretty decent play, just like overall very strong. I will say this deck is probably going to move down a little bit in tier A. I don't expect it to finish at the top of tier A at the end of this video, but I wanted to start it off there as I think it deserves its flowers, as it did win the European International Championships, which is one of the biggest tournaments of the year. Next up here, we have Goldango. Now, this is a deck that surprised a lot of people as well. Ended up getting top 4. There were plenty that did well in the tournament overall. There, I believe, was 1 or 2 in top 16, a couple in, 32-64. The deck just did overall absolutely fantastic. Definitely surprised a lot of people, but it makes a lot of sense. It actually is a pretty good deck right now. Really thrives against matchups like Dragapult Dusknoir, does pretty good against Miraidon as well. Just has some, pretty decent matchups overall. And I respect the deck. I think it's a top of tier B deck. I think it has a lot of potential. However, it is a relatively linear deck, and people kind of have figured, I feel like, it out. Its Cloth matchup is pretty rough too, which I think is one of the things that is, going to hold it back. So yeah, I think it's, a pretty strong deck. Definitely was probably a tier A play heading into the European International Championships, but after Cloth saw so much success, that is one of Goldango's harder matchups, which I think is going to keep it in B right now, but still very powerful for sure. Next up here, we got Archaludon. I think Archaludon is a B tier deck. Ended up getting top 4 at EUIC paired up with the Dialga. I think the Dialga is the best way to play the deck. Definitely provides, an extra layer, of, I guess, just like threats that your opponent has to play around. So yeah, I think that Archaludon is a pretty strong deck. Definitely pretty decently positioned, especially because Cloth just saw a bunch of success. You do struggle to the Goldango matchup, though. Definitely not one of your better matchups, but you take pretty close matchups against a lot of other things. Like your Dragapult matchup is relatively close. Your Gardevoir matchup is also relatively close as well. So yeah, I think it's a pretty decent deck overall. It's pretty, simple to play too. Pretty easy to kind of get it going, which is, nice. So yeah, there's a pretty, stable strategy, and you can kind of do the same thing over and over again. So yeah, it's a good deck. I definitely think that it makes a respectable play. Next up here, we have Ceruledge. We're just going to put Ceruledge in tier C. I think Goldango is pretty much just a better Ceruledge, but I think that Ceruledge is, pretty cool. I just think that Goldango kind of does a lot of the things that Ceruledge wants to do, but a little bit more consistently. Just, having access to things, like the coin bonus to draw cards is, really nice. So yeah, overall, I think Ceruledge is okay, but I do prefer Goldango as my one-shot linear deck of choice. Next up here, we have Lawson Toolbox. I think Lawson Toolbox is in a pretty good position right now. I think that its matchup against Dragapult is relatively decent. Your Gardevoir matchup is relatively decent as well. I feel like they're both relatively close. It kind of depends on how well they know how to play the matchup, and also what tech cards they have. Yes, if the Gardevoir player plays things like Fluttermane and also Klefki, things can be really, really difficult. But if they don't play those cards, then I think you're pretty good into that matchup. And also, if that Dragapult player is able to get into the Badoo at the beginning of the game and is able to kind of use that over and over and over again, then things can be relatively tough for Lost Zone. However, if they aren't necessarily able to do that, and Lost Zone gets a Cramorant going relatively quickly, then I think that matchup is relatively okay. Your matchup against like Archaludon is pretty good. Your Miraidon matchup is pretty good. Yeah, I think the deck is pretty decent. It's just pretty prone to some of the top decks teching for it or knowing how to play against the matchup. So yeah, I think it's a pretty solid B tier deck. Definitely expect it to show up and would not be surprised to see some do well. Next up here, we got Charizard, both just, I guess, regular Charizard, maybe with like TM Evo or something, and Charizard Pidgeot. Both of these decks I don't think are necessarily great at the moment. Charizard Pidgeot's okay. You do decently versus, like decks like Gardevoir. Cloth is a fine matchup as well. Not as good anymore as it used to be because of Badoo. But if you do play the Grand Tree and you can, kind of get your board state set up, it might be a little bit better. But yeah, Charizard's biggest problem is the Dragapult matchup. It does kind of a lot of like what Dragapult wants to do. It's pretty much a stage 2 that, hits for a decent amount of damage. But it's struggles, to Badoo, whereas, Dragapult is built to kind of handle it. So they're kind of similar decks in a way where they have, also access to things, like Dusknoir, but I just think, Dragapult does the majority of things better than Charizard right now. So yeah, Charizard is an okay deck, but I definitely will not be playing it heading into this tournament, but, I wouldn't be surprised if one or two, might show up and surprise some people. Next up here, we got Miraidon. I think Miraidon is a B tier deck. I think it's, pretty solid at the moment. We're going to put it above Lost Zone, Toolbox, and Goldango. I think it's a top of B tier deck. Yes, it didn't do necessarily great at the European International Championships. I feel like a lot of people were prepared for it. However, at the Merida Regional Championships and the Puerto Rico Special Event, the deck saw a lot of success taking down both of those tournaments. So I think that since the deck didn't necessarily do very well at the European International Championships, some people might stop, kind of teching for it or, focusing their deck around, taking a favorable Miraidon matchup, and then Miraidon comes back and sees a lot of success. So yeah, I think that Miraidon is a pretty solid deck overall. You're pretty close into the majority of the top decks. Decks like Dragapult, you're pretty close into Gardevoir. I definitely think you're favored against Cloth. I think you're also pretty close against 2, because it's pretty much just a 2-2-2 prize race, and Miraidon is actually able to keep up versus Cloth relatively decently. So yeah, I think the deck is, pretty good overall. Definitely think it makes an okay play. Next up, we got Raging Bolt. I think Bolt is just worse Miraidon. I guess like in a lot of ways, it's a little bit more linear than Miraidon, as Miraidon has, things like Iron Hands to like help out versus the one prize matchups. It's just, a relatively fair and balanced turbo deck at the moment. I don't think it necessarily does a lot better than, things like the Dawn, even I guess like Roaring Moon as well. I know we're not including that today, but I think that like Roaring Moon might even be above this. So yeah, Bolt is just relatively average, not necessarily super strong right now. Its Gardevoir matchup is tough. Its Cloth matchup is not great. Its Goldango matchup is not great. Its Lost Zone matchup is not great. Its Miraidon matchup is fine. But yeah, your matchups against a lot of other things aren't necessarily great, but you do pick up quite a few wins just because your deck is able to run the opponent over. So, what you lose in matchup spread, you can kind of gain in consistency because your deck is, pretty I feel like able to do the same thing over and over and over again. So yeah, I think that Bolt is relatively okay, but I think it's not one of the best turbo decks right now. Next up here, we got Lugia. I think Lugia is really good right now. I think that with Miraidon not seeing as much success, I do think that Lugia puts itself in a really strong spot as you do take decent matchups against a large portion of the metagame, especially some of the top decks. For example, things like Gardevoir, you're pretty decent against. Dragapult, I think you're pretty favored versus. Your Cloth matchup is relatively solid as well. Your Goldango matchup is pretty good too. So yeah, I think you're pretty good against a lot of, the top decks. However, you run into consistency problems sometimes, and also the Miraidon matchup can be quite tough as well. So yeah, I think that, Lugia is in a pretty decent position right now, and I definitely expected to see some success. Next up here, we got the non-Dusknoir variant that some very known players like Tord Reklev, Miroslav, who won LAIC. Gabriel Fernandez as well played a variant of Dragapult. They didn't all play the exact same list. I know Vinny Fernandez as well played the, I believe, same list or very similar to Gabriel Fernandez and got top 8 in the Masters division. So yeah, lots of different Dragapult without Dusknoir decks that were able to make it into day 2. I think the deck is, pretty good. I think it's, definitely one of the better decks. You play usually a heavier count of the Badoo, potentially things like Blood Moon Ursaluna. Some players were also playing the Lost Cities too, which can help out, versus the Dragapult, versus Gardevoir matchup, because you can get rid of their Monkey Dories and Lost Zone them. Also pretty good in the mirror match too in some situations. But yeah, this deck is also playing things like Monkey Dory as well, which is pretty cool when you're playing against Dragapults. So yeah, I think this deck is pretty good. I personally am more of a Dusknoir enjoyer. I think that this deck definitely caught plenty of people off guard, because they might have been expecting that Dusknoir line and then they didn't see it, and there was a bunch of other like random cards in the deck that kind of surprised people. But now the deck's on the radar, and I think more people kind of have an idea of how to play against it. So I do think that this deck is strong, but still has some flaws for sure. I will say its Lugia matchup isn't necessarily very good. Its Dragapult matchup feels about 50-50. Its Gardevoir matchup is relatively fine, because you also have access to things like Unfair Stamp, which is really, really good versus Gardevoir. So yeah, I think the deck is fine, but I personally like the Dragapult Dusknoir variant just a little bit more, as I feel like there's some more options versus some of your harder matchups. So yeah, strong deck for sure. Next up here, we got, let's go into Dragapult Dusknoir. I've been, kind of mentioning it. I think it's one of the best decks, if not the best deck in the format overall. I think it will see the most play at the Vancouver Regional Championships. It's pretty much good into mostly everything. It kind of has a chance versus everything. Its, Cloth matchup is pretty decent. Its Gardevoir matchup is close. Pretty much all the other matchups I would say are relatively competitive. Your Lugia matchup is definitely pretty rough, but if you want to increase that matchup, you could potentially play things like Temple of Sinnoh, but also Lugia sometimes just bricks out of the game, like anyway. So yeah, I think that Pult is, pretty good overall. It's just kind of like the 50-50 or better versus the majority of the format deck. And those decks usually do quite well, especially when piloted by top players. So yeah, I think that Pult's a great deck, in my opinion, tier A, top of tier A as well. One of, if not the best deck in the standard format. Next up, we got Snorlax Stall. Snorlax Stall did actually relatively decently at EUIC. There were 2 that made it into top 8. I think the deck is relatively decent. I will say its Dragapult matchup is not great, and neither is its Gardevoir matchup, especially if they know how to play against the matchup. So yeah, those matchups are kind of sketchy. Your Cloth matchup isn't necessarily great as well, because they're now playing 4 switch cards, so they can kind of overwhelm you. So yeah, I think this deck is relatively decent, not necessarily overwhelming in any way. Yeah, I think it's just a pretty fair deck right now. It's good against some decks, not so great against some decks, very matchup dependent. So yeah, I have Snorlax Stall currently in B. Next up here we have Gardevoir. Gardevoir here I'm going to put in tier A. I think Gardevoir definitely one of the most powerful decks in the format. There's honestly multiple different ways you can play it. You can play things like Secret Box, you can play Hyper Aroma, you can play Unfair Stamp. I personally am a fan of either Unfair Stamp or the Hyper Aroma, but I also think Secret Box is, pretty good as well. So yeah, I think that, Gardevoir is pretty good. It's kind of similar to Dragapult, where you take 50-50s against a lot of different matchups. Yeah, I think it's, pretty solid overall. And I definitely think it makes to be one of the better plays heading into this tournament, especially because it didn't also necessarily do that well at EUIC. Potentially some people might be kind of taking it off their radar, which they shouldn't be, but I think it makes a very, very solid play for this event. Last up here, we have Regidrago. Regidrago is, in my opinion, kind of just worse Dragapult in a lot of ways. I still think it's, pretty solid. But I think that, I'm going to put Raging Bolt above it. Yeah, I think that like Regidrago is relatively okay. I think that I would say it's a little underrated right now, but I don't think it's necessarily better than a lot of these decks, in tier B, and especially the tier A. So yeah, it's like fine. Badoo can cause some problems, but you can play Crispin to, kind of remedy that a little bit. But yeah, it seems like a pretty decent deck. I've played a few games with it, and it's, not too bad. But yeah, anyways, that is going to do it today for my tier list. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Let me know if there was any decks that I should have included as well. But anyways, that is going to do it for today. If you enjoyed the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thanks so much for all the support as always. I appreciate it. This is Smart TCG, and I'll speak with you guys again soon. Peace out.